So you're hearing now side effects of the vaccine. Back to the CDC website. This is an explanation of how the vaccines work. And they explicitly say they do not affect or interact with our DNA. In other words, this is our genetic material. You know, mRNA, RNA, and DNA, they're different, but they're related. Our DNA is in our natural cells, and it runs everything. The RNA is the vaccine, and they're saying that the mRNA from these vaccines do not enter the nucleus of the cell where our DNA is. There's no way it can change or influence our genes. This is a study from the current issues in molecular biology. When was this? I think early 22. It took about 6 hours for the mRNA of a vaccine in a petri dish with human liver cells to enter the liver cells and for the liver DNA to produce the RNA from that vaccine. So this is concrete evidence that the CDC website is wrong on this. And they've also, other studies in this found the mRNA enters cells of the kidney, lung, liver, spleen, heart, brain, ovaries, and testes.
Other than that.
Yeah. All right. I want to move on to something else, another issue. I don't know if people out there or people on the panel, how familiar you are with this concept of excess overall mortality. The insurance and actuary industry in the last year finding out about that. Anybody want to comment on that, or anybody aware of that?
Yeah, I had seen one study only which showed that the excess mortality had gone up, but they related it completely to the virus. They said, yeah, there was some excess death due to the vaccine, but there was a lot of excess death because kids were getting, because of COVID itself. So I have seen some of the studies though that have shown that, and I think you're pointing to one now, but that's about all I had seen.
Anybody else want to? Hans?
Yeah,
Hans, seriously, thank you. Please stand so the video can record it.
This initially came out December 31st of 21. An insurance executive from a medium-sized company came out and said, we had 40% more payout on deaths since the vaccine came out. And that was big news. You would think that'd be like trumpeted everywhere, but that was the last I heard of it. And I kept watching and watching and watching for more studies. Finally, one came out that did a survey of the top 10 life insurance companies in America, and their average increased payout in the year after the vaccine came out was 30% more payout for deaths. So, it's pretty strong evidence that people are dying. Nobody wants to talk about why. And the CDC, they have the numbers on who's dying. They have all those numbers. They just don't release them.
And so that we're clear on this, COVID really hit in 20, and the vaccine came out late 20, early 21. That's where it really got rolling. So if you look at the overall mortality of the United States, regions of the United States, and there's also this next slide, this is from Europe. So other countries are reporting the same thing. The overall mortality, all-cause mortality, you would think if you have a significant pandemic that's killing people, that you'll see a bump in the overall mortality. And there wasn't really much of that big of a bump. And the thinking on that is, well, it's killing most of the people that are elderly, infirm, they have problems anyway, so you're not going to see a real jump in the overall mortality. On the other hand, in 21, when the vaccine rolled out, life insurance companies and then disability insurance companies noticed an unusual bump in their payouts. And a 40% increase, I mean, that doesn't happen, once every 200 years. Once every 200 years will you have a random fluctuation like that. So that's a signal that something weird is going on. What could it be? Well, COVID was already running through, and that was kind of static from 20 to 21 and into 22. You know, we had the different waves, but the mortality from COVID was less in 21 than in 20. But the overall mortality, and especially what's interesting is the disability payouts. Who gets disability insurance? People with jobs. They're young enough, they're in the workforce. They're not the ones that are going to be dying from COVID. And it's interesting that you don't see this covered in the media. In the mainstream media, you don't hear about it. And there was have you heard of this acronym, SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome? Have you heard of SADS? You've heard of this. Sudden Adult Death Syndrome. And you can see where it's covered sometimes, and they won't even mention the COVID vaccine as a possible contributor to this.
Yeah, I heard that we're baffled by SADS.
Yeah.
I read we're baffled by it. So
Yeah.
medical experts are.
All right. This slide is up to basically address the question of credibility. I'll just look at the highlighted portions. This is a criticism of the CDC, some of the stuff that we've seen tonight and other things. Rather than go through this whole thing, I want to get down to something toward the bottom here, somewhere over here. Yeah, months later, the CDC published a stronger cohort study showing clearly that natural immunity was more robust than vaccine-induced immunity. So the CDC published a report that conflicted their earlier two studies, and it acknowledged that you do have robust immunity. But remember that earlier slide I showed you that there was the fact and the myth that Dr. Weslow said was inverted? That was from since this. I mean, that was just in the last month. So they haven't changed their website to reflect their own study. Have people heard of the Great Barrington Declaration? Anybody up here a signatory to the Great Barrington? Show of hands. Why not, Hans?
Oh, I think I am.
Oh, yeah.
I went on. Now I remember. That was March of 2020 when it first came out.
I think it was October. It came out later than I thought, but they're talking about it coming out in October. Anyway, the Great Barrington Declaration, 3 prominent scientists in this area, Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard, came out and they issued this statement which said we ought to do our best to protect the vulnerable. If we have a vaccine, okay, you can vaccinate the real vulnerable, but don't try to get ahead and vaccinate and prevent a pandemic. That's not going to work. And all the lockdowns and all these preventive measures, if you have people that are in sufficient health that they're going to withstand the infection and get natural immunity from it, that we should let that happen. And this was considered very threatening, I would say, by a lot of the authorities, including this is an email between Anthony Collins and, Francis Collins, Tony Fauci's boss, and Tony Fauci. And after this declaration came out, these scientists that head our scientific organization, the NIH, the quote here is from Collins to his partner: "There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises, of the Barrington Declaration." So the reason I put this up here is these are our scientists, and rather than responding to a scientific question in the traditional scientific way of saying, well, let's engage and let's talk and let's debate, they're calling for a quick and public takedown. In other words, a media war against the declaration. And these are some slides about that. You can get these on our website later if you'd like to look at it more. But that's exactly what happened. And then the last thing I have on this is, finally we have some people within the agencies, the CDC, the NIH, the FDA. They're sort of like whistleblowers. They're coming out and they're expressing their frustration. Again, they don't want to be quoted by name a lot of the time, but they're frustrated that our agencies that we entrust for the public health maybe aren't worthy of that trust. I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment on that, or how about whether or not you should be given an experimental vaccine against your will. This is the Nuremberg Code. Who knows anything about the Nuremberg Code? Look at this audience. That's great. And nobody on the panel's heard of it. So, okay, the Nuremberg Code came out of World War II, the trials in Nuremberg. There were hideous experiments on people, and the Nuremberg Code has been I would say it's the most important guideline.
And the Belmont Declaration.
Yeah. How come you're not talking about this? Stand up, though.
Okay, so
Because you don't like to stand up, that's why.
I just did a leg workout this morning. I'm a little sore. And, yeah.
I could tell.
Yeah. So I don't know the specifics of the Nuremberg Code, but the Nuremberg Code and the Belmont Declaration are two of the important things that have guided research since the middle of the last century. So there was a lot of, I won't say it was the Wild West, but there was a lot of experimentation going on in the early part of the 1900s without the consent of the people that were being experimented on. A few of those would be the Tuskegee syphilis experiment on African Americans in the southern U.S., the concentration camps where atrocious things happen. Actually, in the Japanese prisoner of war camps, the same thing happened. Things like vivisection. And from all of these atrocities, there came an international agreement. But specifically, we can look at the U.S., and there's principles that must be followed before an experimental medication can be administered. First of all, informed consent. I think the Belmont Act defines it in loose terms as beneficence, beneficence, respect of persons, and I forgot the third one. But from these comes a code that you must follow as a researcher. First of all, a person needs to give informed consent. Second of all, if there are potential side effects of the medication that are identified, or of the intervention, I should say, then the potential for good has to outweigh those potential side effects. So that's the principle of beneficence. So it has to be, and then there's a principle of justice. So if somebody if somebody could benefit to it, it has to be offered to all people from that group. So you can't cherry pick. You can't say, well, I want these people and not these people. And you can't experiment on certain classes of people that may have impaired judgment or could be coerced. So
No coercion.
No coercion.
No
So
force.
incarcerated
Totally
persons
voluntary.
are problematic. So incarcerated persons, you need a special set of permissions. People with mental defects and children, of course. So that's what can make pediatric research difficult. Is children are not of the age of consent, but must be involved some way, although their parents can consent for them. So those are protected classes of people in the research community. So that's supposed to guide all of the research on non-approved drugs.
So would you say that it's research only, or would you say that people in clinical trials and then people advocating for treating patients even without research, would you say that the Nuremberg Code, those principles apply across the board?
Yeah, the code the Nuremberg Code and the Belmont Declaration are general principles. How they are applied is based on specific statutes.
Yeah.
So it's an ethical principle. So that, yeah, that is supposed to guide human behavior and behavior within the medical field in general. How it's specifically applied may be a little bit more direct.
All right, thank you. I think it's time to maybe take a break if you want. We're going to move into, maybe only like 5 minutes, but move into some of the gender concerns. So the next thing we'll start out with is our American Medical Association and their views toward gender, and we'll pick that up in just about 5 minutes, if that's all right.